Hey y'all, I have another scary story for you guys. I told y'all I would upload part 2 real quick, and I want to talk for just a second before I get into the story because a lot of you seem to be confused. And by a lot of you, I mean like maybe 10 people are confused, but I feel like I should talk about it anyways. It's gonna take me like 2 seconds, I promise. I think because I said that this was Rachel's perspective, a lot of you thought that I meant like Rachel's perspective from the beginning. This part of the story, Come Live in the Ashes of My Heart, is Rachel's perspective when she's trapped in the room. So it's like towards the end of My Job is Watching a Woman Trapped in a Room. So if you didn't watch that video, you have to watch it so you understand where Rachel is, who she is, and how they got to this place. So this is going to be more about the ghost tree, its origins, and all of that stuff. So it's not necessarily her perspective of being locked in the room when Thomas is watching her. I hope that makes sense. I do not even know what that was. I hope that clears it up a little bit because a lot of people were like, I don't know what's going on. And I was like, I probably should have said that before, but for some reason I just assumed you guys would know. I don't know. So if you haven't seen the first part of this story, go watch it. If you haven't even seen the first story, please go watch that first. I will have all of the author's information linked down below. You know the drill. I'm gonna get right into the story. Oh wait, I wanted to say really quick, I promise this will take me like 2 more seconds, just so you guys get an understanding of how hard it is for me to film some of these videos. I've had 2 incredibly awkward experiences in the last 2 days, and I'm gonna tell you about them because it has to do with my voice and me losing my voice so easily. But I lose my voice like no other. And so when I'm out in public, if I'm talking to somebody, it's like we'll be having a conversation. Like I went to the store today. We'll be having a conversation and then it's like my voice will just decide like I don't want to be here anymore. And so they'll ask me a question and I'll go to answer and it'll be like, it's always the most awkward shit because I'm just like, yeah. So if I ever complain about having to film for too long or me not being able to finish a story, that's why. Because I sit here and I have to clear my throat 400 times and it's like I'll be reading an entire sentence and I'll be doing really good, not stuttering, not messing up, and then at the end it's like, ooh, and I'm like, okay, what is going on with my voice? But okay, now I'm gonna get into the story. So this will be the finale to Come Live in the Ashes of My Heart. Journal entry 5. I've learned and experienced a lot more since I started transcribing Justin's book. And this record is quickly becoming more of an insurance policy for my safety than an outlet for some kind of relationship angst. I think I might be in real trouble here, and I don't understand what's going on. But before I get further into that, I will post the last portion of Justin's writing, and then come back after to explain what has happened since I first read it. When I entered the tunnel for the first time, I walked for what seemed like hours. The path would slant up and down, wind this way and that, but the strangest part was that I never grew tired. Whether it was just my exuberance at finally being free of that room, or something suffusing the sweet air I was breathing, I went on until I reached a branching path. I took the rightmost of 3 options and went on. 5 more decisions later, always taking the rightmost option, and I found myself approaching a wall. I feared that my journey was either at an end, or I would have to try and breach the wall to continue, but as I drew closer, it faded away, and my passage was clear. I was in a basement, much like my own, but different in a variety of ways. There was no wall and door partitioning part of the basement into a cell, and the space was entirely bare of any possessions or furniture. After glancing around the basement for a moment, I crept slowly up the steps and eased open the door to the kitchen. The room was bereft of any signs of life or habitation, and the only noise was some distant sound from outside. Exploring the rest of the house, I found much the same. There were no signs of anyone living there. When I looked out the window upstairs, I began to understand why. This version of the house was sitting on the bedrock of a small island surrounded by blue sea as far as the eye could see. That wasn't entirely true, I suppose, as I could see a larger landmass near the edge of the horizon to the west, but that did nothing to change the fact that this house was wholly isolated and remote. In the span of 30 minutes, I'd walked the length and breadth of the island twice, and it confirmed my suspicions that I was alone in this corner of whatever strange world this might be. Well, almost alone. 200 yards from the house, the ghost tree stood proudly, its leaves blowing gently in the breeze coming off the water. It couldn't be the same tree, of course, yet at the same time I felt sure it was. The tree was somehow connecting this place and where I was from like an umbilical cord of some kind. My mind was torn between taking in all the strange and beautiful sights and marveling at the implications of this hidden, alternate world. In the end, the joy of being in fresh air and sunshine won out. I spent an hour walking the small stretch of sandy beach in front of the house and looking at the exterior of the house itself. It was strange. The house was like mine, but it wasn't the same. For one thing, it was in far too good a condition, with none of the age or damage that had existed on mine when I saw its outer walls. For another, there was no sign that a person had ever lived there at all. I saw no screws or nail holes, no faded stains from a piece of furniture or a plant. I thought this wasn't the house at all, but rather the idea of the house, the perfect ideal. The idea was compelling, and for some reason it temporarily mollified my need for further explanation. Still, I couldn't stay here indefinitely. I still needed clean water and food, and I wanted to ensure I could find my way back to my world before I stayed too long, here or elsewhere, if there were other worlds at the end of those other branching paths. With a heavy heart, I went back inside. Going back down into the basement was the hardest part, but I forced myself down the steps and into the place that served as my hell in another version of the world. The wall began to dissolve at my approach, and on impulse, I bent down and scratched the number 2 on the floor in the area where my bed was in my version. I wanted to keep track if there were multiple places too similar to discern, and that seemed the best way on short notice. Then, with a deep breath, I walked back through the wall and into the tunnel. To my surprise, I backtracked rather easily, and within a few minutes I was walking back into my cell. After looking around the room briefly to ensure it truly was my cell, I scratched a 1 into the floor beneath my bed. I then lay down on my bed and began to formulate a plan. I would store up food and water for the next 2 days and then venture back out on the 3rd. Ideally, I would either find the tools in some other world to secure my freedom here, or I would find a world that would be more accepting of me than this one. Either way, the last 2 days have been the hardest of all my time here, I think. The anticipation of new places, of more freedom, is so wonderful I can hardly bear it. The fear that it won't work for me a second time, or that my plan will be discovered, fills me with the deepest dread. But I'm at the precipice now. I've made a crude supply bag out of my pillowcase, and the wall, which has been dormant for the last 2 days, is now already fading away like morning mist in a patch of sunlight. It may be that these are the last words I write in this precious book that has been my sole confidant in the darkest and lightest of these past few days. I hope the end of this story, chronicled or no, finds me well and safe and free. Journal Entry 6. That was the end of the writing of Justin Perring. When I finished reading it, I went back down to that room and saw the number 1 scratched onto the floor as he described, but more than that, I saw what looked like a thin red root sticking out between the bricks of the far wall. It was just outside the edge of the black, spongy man shape on the wall, and when I stepped back, I saw that it was actually close enough to one shadow hand that it looked as though the root and finger were moving to touch each other. I felt a thrill of excitement and fear, and before I knew it, I was reaching out to touch the root myself. A sudden noise from upstairs brought me up shortly, only inches from contact. It was Phil coming home. Still determined and not sure what I'd discovered, I hid the book and went up to greet him, trying to spin vague tales of unpacking and home improvements while counting the hours until he was asleep and I could think of what to do next. Ultimately, I decided it was a good thing that Phil had interrupted me. I needed to learn more about all of this before I made any rash decisions. I started by asking Phil for the name of the real estate agent that had sold us the house. I'd been present for the signing of some paperwork at the end, but I had never dealt with the agent. But Phil told me there was no agent. He had bought the house from an estate administrator who had listed the house online. That was strange because I'd felt sure he had mentioned an agent before, but I couldn't say for sure. He asked why I was wondering, and I made up the excuse that I wanted to know if the old owners had the name of specific paint colors they'd used in the house. In typical Phil fashion, he accepted this without further argument and finished getting ready for bed. The next day, I went to the library, which, unlike every movie or TV show I've ever seen, was grossly unhelpful in finding out any details about the creepy old house I was living in or the prior owners. I was running out of ideas when I passed a sign that said Historical Society. It was apparently a quasi-museum to local history, though its small size and overwhelming devotion old farm equipment and pictures of the main street 50 years earlier didn't give the best impression of its depth or breadth. Fortunately, the woman that ran the place was very friendly and knowledgeable. She said that her great-grandmother had actually been a distant cousin of the Perring family. They were an odd bunch, to be sure, kept to themselves, especially as the boys got older. Then people started noticing that Justin was nowhere to be found. Never came to town or went to church anymore, but it was a different time back then. People tended to their own business more, and they weren't going to ask questions if they didn't have to. Rumors were that Justin had run off or died, and the parents just couldn't take it. So nobody ever saw Justin again? I felt a mixture of sadness and relief welling up inside of me. Sadness that Justin's terrible life had been real, and relief that he might have finally escaped to a better place. She shook her head. No, but the rest of the family didn't last long either. One night, someone came in on them and killed the parents and the brother, or at least that's what people figured. There was blood, and they were all missing, though no bodies were ever found. I couldn't help but feel some grim satisfaction that they were punished for how they had treated Justin. Whatever he did to them, it wasn't enough. But the woman was frowning now. I could have sworn I had a picture of them. I know I did. I swear this is going to drive me crazy until I find it. She looked up from talking to herself and patted my arm with a smile. I'm sorry, honey, but I tell you what, give me your number and I'll send you a copy of the picture if I find it. Half an hour later, I was back down in the basement. Enough with being safe. I wanted to see how much of it was real. I reached out and touched the root, feeling a surge of power flood my body as I did so. Falling back against the rotten mattress, my hand punched through the fabric and onto the rusty springs. I jerked my hand away, fears of tetanus dancing in my head, but I saw no cut or scratch. Besides, I had other things to think about. like how the wall in front of me had just dissolved. Still feeling the rush of energy cackling across my skin, I stood up and I began walking forward. The tunnel was just as he described, and I could smell the sweet glowing air wafting into that dark, secret room as I felt my phone buzz once, then again. Stifling a wave of irritation, I took out my phone and opened it. There were 2 new text messages from a number I didn't have a name associated with. When I opened it, I realized it was the woman from the Historical Society. The first text was a message. It said, "Found it. This is a picture from Easter of 1901. The Baptist Church took family photos for all the local families that were members. This is the pairing family from left to right. John, Stuart, Edna, Justin." The second text was the picture itself. It was black and white, of course, but of surprisingly good quality for its age. Zooming in on my phone, I filled the screen with the faces of each person in turn. John, his smile friendly but sad. Stuart, his eyes hard and stern. Edna, her face open and warm. Justin. It wasn't possible. I texted the woman back, asking her if she was sure. If she was sure that the person in that picture, the person on the far right, was Justin Paring back in 1901. A moment later, she responded that she was certain. Was something wrong? I didn't reply back. I had no response to give that would make any sense. Because the person in the picture, years younger looking, but unmistakably him, the person she said was Justin Paring, I knew him. I knew him very well. It was Phil. Just then, I heard the front door open upstairs. He was home. I considered going upstairs, trying to make up more half-truths or confronting Phil, Justin, but instead I ran into the tunnel. 5 feet in, the wall behind me faded back into view, and while I assumed I could still get back out that way, at that moment I didn't care. I was tired of waiting for something special, tired of being scared when something this magical was right in front of me. I was going to see things for myself instead of just reading about it. The tunnel went on, chamber after chamber of deep red roots and dark, loamy earth. As Justin had described, I eventually came to a branching of paths. Instead of taking the rightmost, I took the center. On and on I went for what felt like hours, but I was never tired or hungry, and with each branching path, I felt my urgency to go further growing, center path each time, always leading to another choice further down the tangled path. Then I saw I was entering a large chamber. It was roughly circular in shape, the ceiling and walls made up of an endless cascade of roots woven tightly together, except for several openings every few feet that I assumed led to other twisting paths. The roots here weren't red for the most part, but a smoky gray that was almost black, and the flesh of those roots were blistered and scarred in many places as though there had been a fire here at one point. Looking to the center of the room, I saw a small upgrowth of branches that looked almost like a pedestal of sorts for the black tangle of roots that lay atop it. If I had a guess, I would say this is where the fire had started, but whatever had happened, the ghost tree, or trees depending on how you looked at it, had survived. I could see green shoots and new, unscarred red bark poking through the black, ashy residue the flames had left behind. I was reaching out to touch it. I felt a strong, compelling need to touch it, but something held me back. Whatever this was, it was clearly significant, important, and I had a sense that in some ways it was more of a doorway and threshold than even passing into the tunnel had been. So I stepped back, picked a new tunnel, and I journeyed on. While my cell phone was useless for phone calls here, I used it to keep track of my choice in the larger chamber and the couple of times when there was an even number of tunnels with no center path to take. Finally, after what felt like another hour or more, I saw a wall. When I approached it, it dissolved away much like the wall in my house had done, but instead of entering a dark secret cell, I appeared to be entering a large, well-lit room that somebody used as a woodworking shop. Entering quietly, I listened for any signs of movement, but there were none. I was still in the basement of the house, a version of the house, and the combination of similarities and differences made it seem surreal. I paused to look under a workbench occupied by a belt sander, and there I saw a faded 43 scratched into the floor where the bed was in my version of the house. Going into the other room, I saw it was some kind of media room, though what I thought must be the television was simply a large pane of either glass or plastic suspended from the ceiling by 2 braided wires. I had no idea how something like that would work, but I suppose it didn't matter. It might be the least of the differences in this world. I crept up the stairs and eased open the basement door, and as it swung open, I saw 2 men sitting at a table eating cereal. Or rather, they had been eating cereal. Now they were staring at me. "What the fuck?" one of them bellowed as he stood up, his expression a dangerous combination of fear and anger. "Who the fuck are you, lady?" The other man was trying to calm him down, but he wasn't listening. I slammed the door back shut before he reached it and ran down the stairs 2 at a time, desperate to reach the wall and terrified that it might not open for me this time. But the tunnel was ready and waiting, and as I passed into it, the wall closed behind me, protecting me. I stood there for a moment, hands on my knees, breathing heavy, more out of fear and adrenaline than exertion. I had to be more careful. I never knew what I was going to be getting myself into, and I had to be ready. I debated heading back then. I could get proper supplies and then head back out to explore more worlds, with more than just my cell phone and determination. But I finally decided I would give it one more try first. I backtracked 2 junctions and then took another path. This time the tunnel went on for quite some time, and after 7 more choices, I found myself at another wall. The basement I entered was pitch black, and I gave a shudder as I crossed over into it with my cell phone's flashlight app acting as my only source of illumination. It was freezing here. I almost turned back, but then I spied a number etched onto the floor. 71. For some reason that made me want to go on. I needed to see more of what Justin had seen, try to understand more of what he experienced before I confronted him. He had obviously been lying to me, possibly trying to trick me into something, and I didn't want to go into that conversation with nothing but his old writings to guide me. So I went forward very slowly into the rest of the basement, holding up my little phone like a guiding star as I pushed through the cold darkness. I listened at the top of the stairs for a couple of minutes before deciding it was probably safe to open it. When I did so, I saw the house was totally empty, much like Justin had described in his trip to the house on the island. I also realized that while the house itself was dark, there was a faint blue glow coming from the windows. My first thought was that I was in a world where it was late twilight or early morning, but when I approached the window over the kitchen sink, I saw I was wrong. I was in a cave. The house, as strange and impossible as it seemed, was sitting in some kind of massive cave. I went to the front door and opened it. The air was even colder outside, and while there was no distinct sources of light, the air was saturated with a soft blue glow. It reminded me in some ways of the light in the tunnel of the ghost tree. But instead of being comforting, it filled me with a vague and terrible sense of dread. Still, I wanted to see this through. I left the front door open for a quick escape and walked a few steps further into the cave. It was an enormous cavern, and in the distance I could barely make out several dark spots I assume were tunnels leading to other parts of whatever cave system this was on whatever world I found myself in. I turned to my right, and I saw the ghost tree there, its red branches and green flowing leaves blowing in the currents of the breeze I couldn't feel. I felt a surge of happiness at seeing it, as though I had run into an old friend, and I found myself heading towards it. And then I noticed the bodies stacked at its base. Perfectly preserved, 20 bodies or more were stacked at the tree's base, and my first thought was that this was some kind of strange offering by whoever or whatever lived here. Then I saw the black lines of corruption that traced itself from several of the bodies to the trunk of the massive tree. The bodies were poisoning it. I saw the distended belly of one of the bodies shift, or something inside of the bodies was poisoning it. I took a step back, taking in more details of the cavern I had stupidly decided would be good to explore. There were more bodies at different spots along the floor, some with swollen, shifting stomachs, others looking as though they were simply taking a nap. All told, I saw over 100 bodies in the dim gloom of that unending indigo light, and among all those bodies were numerous lines cut in the stony floor, almost as though they had been cut with a blade or a saw. "What do you offer as tribute for your need, traveler?" The voice echoed in my mind like the high tones of a church bell. Intelligent and feminine, it carried an undercurrent of inhuman emotion that could have been a cousin of anger or amusement or both. I spun around, looking for the source. At first I saw nothing, but then at one of the black tunnels in the distance, I saw a pair of blue flames dancing in the air. They were its eyes. I ran into the house, shutting the front and basement door behind me as I ran down the stairs and back into the tunnel. That was enough for me. I wanted to go home and leave all of this behind. I would talk to Justin Phil if he wanted, but that was after I was done packing my shit, never coming back to any version of that fucking house ever again. It took what seemed like hours to make it back. I found the way easily, and even when I ran across that central burned chamber with its multitude of paths, I picked the right one without hesitation, but it still felt like it was taking forever. When I finally crossed back into Justin's cell, I was so filled with relief that it took me several moments to notice what was different. The wall dividing the cell from the rest of the basement was back up. I had dismantled a large central portion of that brick wall that had separated Justin's room from the rest of the house, and that had all been replaced with new bricks, except for a small space 2 bricks wide and tall. It was just enough space for me to see Phil looking at me. "Hey there, honey. Been on a little trip, have you? You have a good time?" I ran up to the wall, realizing in passing that the cell was now lit by a pair of LED lanterns on the nightstand and chest, respectively. He was setting me up in here. The bastard. "Phil, Justin, whatever you call yourself, let me out of here." He smiled at me pleasantly. "No can do, Buttercup. And even if I did, it wouldn't do you any good. You belong to the tree now. I felt it when it passed from me to you." I pushed against the brick angrily, but it didn't budge. "Why are you doing this?" I paused and added, "I love you." His smile grew colder. "That's real cute. You know, you've been gone for an entire day. I only started working on the wall a couple of hours ago. Before that, I did some light reading. Your precious fucking journal." Taking a couple steps back, he lifted my journal from a dwindled stack of bricks he had brought down for the job. "You see, the difference between your journal and mine is that I had actual problems to write about. Well, that and mine is far better written. Jesus, I had a 9th grade education when I wrote this, and you have a master's degree. The modern education system really is shit." He shook his head before taking a deep breath. "But no, I'm mad and hurt, and it's making me petty. Let me start over." He sat the journal back on the bricks and approached the hole in the wall. When I went into those tunnels again, I was so happy and excited. I thought I was about to go on some magical adventure and live a life full of freedom and wonder. Instead, you know what I found? My mind was still racing for some way out of this, but I thought it best to humor him for now. "What's that?" He wasn't smiling any longer. After traveling to over 200 different worlds, I figured out 3 things. 1. Many worlds are filled with people like us. After a few dozen of those, I gave up on finding a world where people aren't largely selfish pieces of shit. 2. Some of those worlds are much, much worse. Phil paused, cocking his head. "Which ones did you go to?" I don't know if you noticed, but I numbered pretty much everyone I went to. I stared at him dully, trying not to show how much I wanted to break through that wall and reach him. 43 and 71. He seemed to ponder for a moment, then his eyes went wide. 71? Oh shit, really? You have an awesome sense of direction. Wow. Yeah, I don't advise a return trip there. I shuddered at the memory. Yeah, I don't plan to. Look, I don't want to go anywhere anymore. Please just let me out, and I'll do whatever you want. Stay, go, I don't care. Just don't leave me in here. He was already shaking his head, and he actually looked sad now. No, I'm sorry, but no. Because the 3rd thing I figured out was that once you touch the root and enter the tunnel, you're bound to the ghost tree. At first I thought it was a gift. I aged incredibly slowly. I never got hungry or thirsty or tired in the tunnels. I had all of these places I could go. Phil shoved my journal off the brick pile onto the floor and sat down. But after a few months of that, I got tired of it. I found a world that seemed to be less terrible than most, and I settled down. I built a life there. I fell in love. He put his hands in his lap, and I could see they were balled into fists. And then one day I woke up in the tunnels, in what I call the heart room. I found my way back to my new world, my new life, but the tree wouldn't open that way. Eventually I figured out that I would have to go back and stay with it in the heart room. I couldn't explore any world during that time. It would seem like an eternity passed, and periodically I would go back to the tunnel I needed and see the wall was still up, until finally it wasn't. I was so happy. I ran through the basement, up the stairs. I set out to find my girlfriend or any friends I had made. That's when I realized 10 years had passed. He leaned forward and looked at me somberly. What it amounts to is this. You can go and explore, but after about 2 to 3 years, the tree pulls you back. And after that, you have to stay with it for 5 times whatever time you had on the outside. I don't know if it's lonely, or if it needs us for something, or if it's just mean, but those are the rules. I started to say I was sorry, but he just raised his hand with a glare. Save it. I'm trying to explain as a kindness, so you don't start all this totally in the dark like I was. Don't push it. He waited a second, then went on. After I figured out how much time had passed, I gave up on staying in that world. I went to exploring again, although without the hope of a permanent life somewhere, it didn't mean as much. I figured out what I'm telling you over the years, staying for different amounts of time in different places, and after everything I saw, I realized something. I wasn't special. None of us are. I've seen multiple older versions of myself. They were all unremarkable. I've met people across scores of worlds, and there aren't more than a handful that stand out. But while that was depressing in some ways, it also gave me hope that I didn't have to be the one to bear this burden forever. I could find a replacement. As I think you may have figured out by now, I did away with my parents and brother too. It was during a dark time early on, before I had found my new world and love, but after I'd become despondent in my travels. I came back and killed them in their sleep, dragging their bodies into the tunnel for a reason that made sense at the time but is lost on me now. Years later, I come back and bought the house from the bank who was left holding it. Oddly enough, people hadn't been lining up to buy the old murder house with the creepy vibes, so I got it cheap. This was in the 1950s. I've been sitting on it since, periodically coming out to try and find a good replacement. but it hasn't been easy. I figured out over time that you can't just knock somebody out and put them in the tunnel. You can't force them to agree to enter it either. No. You have to voluntarily touch the route and enter the tunnel for them to be bound in your place. He laughed bitterly. Of course, I didn't know that for sure until now. It was all guesswork. About 15 years ago, I decided it was no use, and I was better off trying to kill the fucking tree, even if I died with it. So I came out, I got a drum of gasoline, and I tried to burn down the heart room. Yeah, I saw. He looked up at my words and grinned, giving a nod. Didn't look like it worked too well. His expression darkened and he stood back up. No, it didn't. I think I heard it, but I don't know if it can die. So I gave up on that and went back to trying to find somebody I could get to take my place, if it was even possible. That's when you came along. Well, not you, but another version of you. My eyes widened. What are you talking about? He quirked an eyebrow. What do you think? Alternate worlds, alternate you. Keep up. I met another version of you and got into a relationship with them. I got them to the house, but they weren't as curious and hardworking as you are. They didn't take the bait for my subtle hints or even me discovering the hidden room I had made there. By the time I was getting them interested, I was pulled back into the fucking heart. You should have given them a mysterious note. I know I should keep quiet since I just made him angrier, but I couldn't help it. But this time, Phil was looking confused. Note? I didn't ever leave you a... Oh wait, what did it say? Come live in the ashes of my heart. You're saying you didn't write that? It was in your, or at least your old Justin handwriting. Phil shrugged. Honestly, no note from me. I guess the tree did it. Its attempt at being mysterious and ironic, maybe? I don't know. I wondered how you got onto it so quick. I guess the tree was tired of me too, which is understandable. He looked away, his expression strange. Anyways, when I could leave the tunnels again, I came back here and found you. Sought you out, if I'm being honest. And you know, I actually loved you. I've been really conflicted this entire time, if I could even go through with this. Well, he glanced down at my journal on the ground, at least before reading that. He turned around and grabbed up a new brick, scraping mortar into the space it was going to. I started screaming for him to stop, but he didn't pause. After a couple of minutes, there was only one brick left out of place. I put those lanterns in there for you, and there's a backpack on the bed with food and water. I'd suggest you travel around, just be careful and mind your time limits. Don't get too attached to any place because you can't stay forever. And I left you a new journal on the chest. Maybe you'll write about this part too. If you leave it behind when you're done, I'll keep it safe. Maybe let other people read what you wrote even. It won't matter. He paused, his eyes troubled. I guess I'll be the villain in your story. He started putting the mortar around the edges of the final opening. I went to 211 different worlds. And you know what? There were cells like this one in 93 of them, along with 93 corpse versions of me. Living in that room, I'd always wanted to believe that my family had just made a mistake, that they were good people that just picked the wrong way when the path forked. But no, that was just who they were, through and through. He put the last brick into position and started pushing it in. I guess everyone is someone's villain. I don't want the story to be over. There's a blue link at the bottom and I'm clicking on it. Nope. Okay, there's no more to the story. I'm so sad. I've never had a story come full circle like that and genuinely make me sad, especially when they were like talking about how they loved each other. I know she was lying, but when he was like, I really did love you, I was like, oh my God. I'm gonna move so the lighting's better so we can talk about this. I had someone asking me to try to explain the story because they were a little bit confused, and I feel like knowing what I said at the beginning, where this story technically starts, I hope that helped a little bit, but we're gonna talk about it for a second. I still want to know how they figured out that Rachel knew about the ghost tree. Like, who knew about this and how did they find her and then also trap her in a new room in another world, you know what I mean? Because Thomas finds her through the tunnel. So he goes through the tunnel and he finds her in the room that Phil trapped her in because Phil was just in. But how did they know about the ghost tree? That's what I'm confused about. Maybe I missed something. Maybe I'm just dumb as fuck. It also makes me kind of sad because at the end of my job as watching a woman trapped in a room, they walk away together and I don't want them to fall in love if they can't be with each other forever. And so this bitch is either gonna pass it on to Thomas, or wait, I think she might have already done that because he went through the tunnel. So wait, I think, okay, I might just be saying some like really obvious shit here. I think when he went through the tunnel, Rachel passed it on to him. So now it's just sad because they're gonna go and walk away with each other and try to be happy, and then Thomas is gonna be taken into the heart room of the ghost tree, and he's not gonna be happy anymore with Rachel. Rachel, you're a bitch. I also really hate Justin right now, but it's hard for me to hate him because of all the things that he went through. And it's like he really had no choice but to pass it on to somebody else. He can't do this for the rest of his life. And so it's so hard because I don't know if I hate her or if I'm like okay with it, but then I also am like really upset for Rachel, and then I hate Rachel for passing it on to Thomas, and I don't know how to feel. My mind is literally like so jumbled right now because I'm trying to process all of it and I cannot talk about it because it's not gonna make any sense. But I really hope you guys enjoyed. I can't even say it enough. This is one of the best stories I have ever read on my fucking channel. And somebody commented, they were like, this isn't my favorite because of Tia. But okay, none of Tia's stories even count whenever I say like this is my favorite, because her stories will always be my favorite. But this was seriously incredible. I'm amazed right now. And all I want to do is like listen to myself read the story, which is kind of weird. This is going to be the end of the story though. There's not going to be any more parts to it. This was like the 2 stories that connected. That's it. That's the end. Someone recommended me another story from Brandon, so I'll have to look into that one. He's going to be like, oh my God. Also, I'm like really anxious because it's Monday right now when I'm filming this, and VidCon is literally, I leave on Thursday and I haven't done shit. I don't have any videos ready. I haven't streamed in like over a week and I don't know what to do. I'm scared. Okay, see ya.